You've clearly achieved much for a rural student, but Westridge cultivates global leaders, not local farmers. Dean Thompson's voice carried across his polished office as 18-year-old Emma Walker stared at her rejection letter, the crisp Westridge University letterhead blurring through her tears. But just 1 week later, when a sleek private jet with Walker AgriTech Solutions emblazoned on its side touched down on the university's private airstrip, the dean's condescending smile vanished as an elegant woman in a tailored business suit descended the stairs, flanked by a team of internationally renowned scientists. "I'm Dr. Sarah Walker, CEO of Walker AgriTech Solutions and Emma's mother. I believe we should discuss your admissions criteria before my company finalizes its $25 million research partnership with any university this year. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Westridge University dominated the rolling hills of New England like a medieval fortress of academia. Its centuries-old stone buildings and perfectly manicured quads represented the pinnacle of educational prestige, where generations of America's elite had been groomed for positions of power and influence. Gothic spires reached toward the sky, as if straining to touch the rarefied air of intellectual superiority the institution prided itself on maintaining. The university's brochures and website prominently featured claims of seeking diverse perspectives and innovative thinking from all walks of life, though in practice, this diversity rarely extended beyond the children of coastal elites and international business magnates. The student body was a carefully curated collection of legacy admissions, prep school valedictorians, and the occasional scholarship student whose presence allowed for congratulatory press releases about inclusivity. Dean Richard Thompson presided over undergraduate admissions with meticulous attention to what he called the Westridge profile. At 56, his silver hair and tailored suits projected exactly the image of distinguished authority the university cultivated. His office, housed in Pembroke Hall, the oldest building on campus, was a shrine to tradition and prestige. Bookshelves, lined with leather-bound volumes, walls adorned with portraits of distinguished alumni, and a mahogany desk that had served deans for generations created an atmosphere that intimidated visitors before a word was spoken. Under Dean Thompson's 15-year tenure, Westridge had become increasingly selective, a fact he mentioned in every interview and alumni newsletter. The university now boasted the third lowest acceptance rate in the country, accepting just 8% of applicants. This selectivity was a point of pride for Thompson, who saw his role not just as selecting students, but as preserving the unique character and traditions that make Westridge exceptional. The dean moved through the admission department's offices. On a bright March morning, his leather shoes clicking against the marble floors as he addressed his team of admissions officers gathered for the final selection meeting for the incoming class. "I'm pleased to report that our acceptance rate has dropped to a record low this year," he announced, unable to hide his satisfaction. "We've managed to be even more selective than last year while still maintaining our commitment to excellence." The team of 15 admissions officers, most Westridge alumni themselves, nodded appreciatively. They had spent months reviewing thousands of applications, categorizing, ranking, and ultimately rejecting the vast majority of hopeful students. "This incoming class truly represents the Westridge ideal," Thompson continued. 92% come from our traditional feeder schools. SAT averages are up 5 points. And we've maintained our strategic balance of legacy admissions and full-paying international students, which will please the Board of Trustees. As they were reviewing the final acceptance list, Thompson's assistant entered with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry to interrupt, Dean Thompson, but there's an applicant here who insists on meeting with you personally. I explained that decisions have been finalized, but she's quite persistent. Thompson frowned, checking his gold watch. Who is it? Emma Walker from Lakeside. She was in the regional consideration pool. A flicker of recognition crossed Thompson's face. Ah, the farm girl with the science project. Very well, I can spare 10 minutes. These personal appeals rarely change anything, but it might be a valuable lesson for her about persistence in the face of disappointment. 20 minutes later, Emma Walker entered Dean Thompson's imposing office. At 18, she carried herself with unusual poise, her posture straight and her gaze direct. She wore a simple blue blazer over a white blouse and dark slacks, not designer brands, but clean and professional. In her hands, she clutched a folder containing additional materials not included in her original application. "Thank you for seeing me, Dean Thompson," Emma began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I believe there may have been an oversight regarding my application to Westridge." Thompson gestured to the chair across from his desk, his smile professionally, sympathetic but distant. "Miss Walker, I appreciate your determination, but I assure you every application receives thorough consideration. Our decisions are made through a comprehensive evaluation process. According to your published admission criteria, my qualifications exceed your standards," Emma replied evenly, opening her folder. "I'm valedictorian with a perfect GPA. My SAT score is in the 99th percentile. I've completed 11 AP courses with all fives, and my research on sustainable soil regeneration techniques has been published in the Journal of Agricultural Innovation." Thompson's expression remained unchanged. "Our admission process considers many factors beyond academic metrics, Miss Walker. Westridge seeks students who will contribute to our unique campus culture and demonstrate exceptional achievement in areas we value." "Which areas are those exactly?" Emma asked, her tone respectful but direct. "Your materials emphasize academic excellence, leadership, innovation, and commitment to solving global challenges. I've documented all of these in my application." "Miss Walker," Thompson sighed, leaning back in his chair, "excellence is contextual. Leading a 4-H club or winning a regional science fair simply doesn't carry the same weight as the achievements our successful applicants demonstrate. Students from more traditional backgrounds often struggle with the social and academic environment at Westridge." Emma reached into her folder and placed several documents on the desk. "I've brought additional information about my research work. The soil regeneration technique I developed has been implemented on 6 farms in my county and has increased crop yield by 27% while reducing chemical fertilizer use by 40%. Dr. Harmon from your environmental science department expressed specific interest in this work when we corresponded last year." Thompson glanced at the papers without picking them up. "I'm sure it's very practical work. However, Westridge's environmental programs emphasize theoretical frameworks and policy development, not agricultural techniques. Our graduates typically move into research institutions, international organizations, or policy leadership roles, not back to family farms." "My research isn't about farming techniques," Emma countered, frustration briefly crossing her face. "It's about developing sustainable approaches to food security in changing climate conditions. The preliminary data has been cited by researchers at MIT and Cornell. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Nevertheless," Thompson replied with a note of finality, "we simply don't believe Westridge is the right environment for your educational development." Emma sat straighter. "Is it because I'm from a farming community? Or because I don't have legacy connections or come from a preparatory academy?" Thompson's smile turned cold. "Miss Walker, your insinuations are inappropriate. Westridge values merit above all else." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "I believe our time is up. I wish you the best at your state university, where you'll likely find a more suitable environment." As Emma gathered her untouched documents, Thompson added with practiced condescension, "Not everyone is suited for elite education. There's no shame in finding your appropriate level. My appropriate level is wherever excellence is taught and innovation is valued," Emma replied, meeting the dean's eyes directly. "I came here not because Westridge is my only option, but because your environmental science program aligned with my research interests. We cultivate global leaders at Westridge, not local farmers," Thompson said dismissively. "Your rural background simply doesn't meet our profile for future leadership. Our discussion is concluded." With quiet dignity, Emma collected her papers and stood. "Thank you for your time, Dean Thompson. I think I understand Westridge's values much more clearly now." As the door closed, Thompson returned to his computer, already dismissing the encounter from his mind. He had dozens of emails from prominent families expressing gratitude for their children's acceptance letters and a prestigious institution to protect from those who simply didn't belong in its rarefied atmosphere. Outside, in the visitor parking lot, Emma sat in her used Toyota, her composure finally breaking as tears of frustration welled in her eyes. She had expected the rejection letter, but had hoped that presenting her additional research might make a difference. Now she understood that no amount of academic achievement could overcome the invisible barriers of background and status. She pulled out her phone and called home. "Mom, it's me. The meeting went exactly as you predicted." No, he wouldn't. Even look at the additional research documentation. Yes, he actually said they cultivate global leaders, not local farmers. She listened for a moment, wiping away a tear. "Don't worry about it. I've got other options. Stanford and Cornell both accepted me, and their environmental science programs are actually stronger in sustainable agriculture. I know, but I wanted to give Westridge a chance since they claim to value innovation so much." As Emma drove away from campus, she didn't notice Dean Thompson watching from his office window, a satisfied expression on his face. In his mind, he had maintained Westridge's standards by filtering out a student who wouldn't properly reflect the institution's prestigious image. He had no idea that his smug certainty was about to be dramatically challenged in less than a week. April had transformed Westridge University's campus into a postcard-perfect vision of academic prestige. Cherry blossoms lined the pathways, historic. Buildings gleamed in the spring sunshine, and students in designer casual wear lounged on manicured lawns. The picture of privileged academia. Preparations for the university's annual donor weekend were nearly complete, with banners proclaiming "Shaping Tomorrow's Global Leaders" strategically placed to impress the wealthy donors who would soon arrive. This weekend would be particularly important as Westridge was launching a major capital campaign to fund a new $80 million environmental science and policy center. Dean Richard Thompson was in his element, having spent weeks orchestrating every detail of the weekend's events. The donor gala would showcase Westridge's most impressive students and faculty, with carefully rehearsed presentations designed to loosen checkbooks and secure the endowments that maintain the university's exclusive status. The architectural renderings for the Environmental Science and Policy Center need to be prominently displayed, he reminded his development team during their final planning meeting. Several major technology and energy executives will be attending, and President Chen is counting on us to secure at least half the funding this weekend. The Walker Foundation representatives will be attending as well, his assistant noted. Checking her tablet, they've expressed interest in agricultural sustainability initiatives. "Ah, yes," Thompson nodded. Make sure they see the section on global food security. Their foundation has been generous to several Ivy League environmental programs. The meeting adjourned with Thompson feeling supremely confident. Years of cultivating the right connections had positioned Westridge at the center of elite academic circles, and this weekend would cement relationships with donors who could fund the next decade of expansion. He had personally vetted the guest list, ensuring that only those with appropriate influence and resources received invitations. The first sign that something unusual was happening came shortly after lunch on Friday, as the earliest donors began arriving on campus. Thompson was crossing the main quad when he noticed students gathering at the windows of the administration building, pointing toward the sky. The distant sound of an aircraft broke the carefully cultivated tranquility of the campus atmosphere. His administrative assistant hurried across the lawn, phone in hand. "Dean Thompson, campus security is calling. There's a situation at the university airstrip. They're requesting guidance." "What kind of situation?" Thompson asked, irritation creeping into his voice. The donor weekend required perfection, and unexpected disruptions were not acceptable. "They say there's an unscheduled private jet landing. Security tried to redirect it to the municipal airport, but the pilot had some kind of university authorization." "Authorization? That's impossible. We don't allow unscheduled landings without specific..." His words cut off as he caught sight of what was approaching. Circling elegantly over the campus was a sleek Gulfstream G650 jet, its pristine white fuselage gleaming in the spring sunshine. As it banked toward the university's small private airstrip normally reserved for trustees and major donors, the distinctive logo of Walker AgriTech Solutions became visible on its tail, a stylized W formed from intertwining plant stems. "Call security again," Thompson ordered, his composure slipping. "Tell them to find out who authorized this landing and to escort whoever it is directly to the administration building, away from the donor events." His assistant made the call, then looked up with consternation. "They say they can't intervene. Apparently President Chen's office authorized the landing this morning. The visitors are listed as VIP guests for the Environmental Science Center campaign launch." "That's absurd," Thompson snapped. "I oversee all donor relations for the campaign, and there's nothing on my schedule about Walker AgriTech executives. Get President Chen on the phone immediately." But it was too late to prevent what was unfolding. The elegant jet had touched down and taxied to a stop at the private terminal. Campus security and several university officials, including the vice president of development, were already moving to greet the arrivals with evident enthusiasm. The door of the aircraft opened and a boarding stair descended to the tarmac. First to emerge was a woman in her late 40s, whose poised demeanor and tailored navy suit suggested both confidence and authority. Dr. Sarah Walker, CEO of Walker AgriTech Solutions and one of the most influential figures in sustainable agricultural technology, descended the stairs with practiced ease. Behind her came a small team of distinguished-looking scientists and executives, each carrying materials branded with the Walker AgriTech logo. As a stunned Thompson watched from the edge of the airstrip, the group was warmly greeted by university officials and escorted toward waiting electric carts that would transport them to campus. "Who authorized this?" Thompson demanded of no one in particular, his face flushing with frustration. Professor Michael Rodriguez from the Environmental Science Department overheard his question as he hurried past. "That's Dr. Sarah Walker. Dean Thompson, founder and CEO of Walker AgriTech Solutions. Her company has revolutionized sustainable farming practices across 3 continents. President Chen invited her personally to tour our facilities and discuss potential research partnerships." "Walker?" The name registered immediately, sending a wave of unease through him. "As in Emma Walker's mother?" "Yes, Rodriguez confirmed. Continuing toward the greeting party, President Chen has been courting Walker AgriTech for months. They're considering a $25 million research partnership, and several universities are competing for it. Having Dr. Walker here for donor weekend is quite a coup for Westridge. Thompson stood frozen, watching as Dr. Walker expertly engaged with faculty and administrators, her charismatic presence drawing others toward her group. Her team had begun setting up sleek digital displays along the path to the Environmental Science Building, showcasing Walker AgriTech's innovative technologies and global impact. As if summoned by his thoughts, Thompson spotted Emma among the crowd, engaged in animated conversation with several faculty members while pointing toward one of the digital models. Unlike their previous meeting, Emma now moved with complete confidence, clearly in her element as she explained technical details to interested professors. Before Thompson could decide how to respond, he saw President Patricia Chen striding across the quad, hand extended to greet Dr. Walker. The university's leader was smiling broadly, her body language communicating both respect and eagerness as she welcomed the distinguished visitor. Gathering his composure, Thompson made his way toward the gathering, positioning himself to intercept the president and insert himself into the conversation. Years of navigating academic politics had taught him the art of managing unexpected situations while maintaining an appearance of control. Dr. Walker, what an unexpected pleasure, he began as he approached the group, extending his hand with practiced warmth. I'm Dean Richard Thompson, head of admissions. Had I known you were planning this visit, I would have personally ensured appropriate arrangements were made. Dr. Walker turned to face him, her expression pleasant but unreadable. Dean Thompson? Yes, I believe you've met my daughter Emma. Her voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and international negotiations. President Chen looked between them with interest. You're already acquainted. Excellent. Dean Thompson is one of our most valued administrators, responsible for selecting the exceptional students who make Westridge what it is today. Indeed, Dr. Walker replied evenly. Emma and Dean Thompson had quite an illuminating conversation about Westridge's values when she received her rejection letter last week. A momentary silence fell over the group. President Chen's smile faltered slightly as she glanced at Thompson. Rejection letter? Dr. Walker, there must be some misunderstanding. With Emma's exceptional credentials and your family's distinguished background in agricultural innovation, she would be exactly the kind of student Westridge seeks to attract. That wasn't the impression she received, Dr. Walker replied, her tone remaining measured but with steel beneath the polite exterior. In fact, Dean Thompson was quite explicit that Westridge cultivates global leaders, not local farmers, and that Emma's rural background doesn't meet the profile for future leadership at your institution. The blood drained from Thompson's face, as his own words were quoted back to him in front of the university president and an increasingly interested circle of faculty, donors, and students. Smartphones had appeared, recording the interaction, though he was too focused on the unfolding disaster to notice. There must be some context missing from that exchange, he managed, looking desperately to President Chen for support. Our admissions process is highly competitive, and we consider many factors, like family background and social status, Dr. Walker suggested mildly. Those seem to be the deciding factors in Emma's case, despite her perfect academic record and published research. President Chen's expression had transformed from confusion to alarm. Dr. Walker, I assure you this doesn't reflect Westridge's institutional values. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in my office. Actually, Dr. Walker interrupted, politely, I believe this is exactly the right venue for this conversation. Your beautiful campus green, surrounded by your students and faculty with our agricultural technology as backdrop. She gestured to the impressive array of digital Displays showing Walker AgriTech's global projects. After all, isn't education about bringing different worlds together? Rural innovation meeting academic tradition. Emma had approached during this exchange and now stood beside her mother, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to Thompson's growing discomfort. Madam President, Dr. Walker continued, I came here today not just to showcase our technology, but to discuss a potential $25 million research partnership for sustainable agricultural innovation. Walker AgriTech is establishing partnerships with universities that demonstrate genuine commitment to bridging theoretical research with practical applications, institutions that value knowledge regardless of its source. President Chen nodded eagerly, which is exactly what Westridge strives to do, Dr. Walker. Our proposed Environmental Science and Policy Center will revolutionize, but that's not what you currently do, is it? Dr. Walker interrupted gently. Not if your admissions dean believes that rural agricultural expertise is inherently less valuable than urban academic credentials. Not if brilliant students like my daughter are rejected because they come from farming backgrounds rather than preparatory academies. The crowd had grown, and Thompson realized with horror that several major donors who had arrived early for the weekend were among those listening intently to the exchange. The narrative he had carefully constructed about Westridge's values and mission was unraveling before his eyes. I'm not here seeking special treatment for Emma, Dr. Walker continued. She's already accepted offers from Stanford and Cornell, both of which recognize the value of her research and background. I'm here because your president expressed interest in Walker AgriTech's educational partnerships, and I needed to determine whether Westridge's stated commitment to environmental innovation is genuine or merely a convenient fundraising narrative. She turned slightly, ensuring her next words carried to the assembled crowd. I believe we need to discuss your admissions practices and institutional values before my company finalizes its $25 million research partnership with any university this year. The fallout was immediate and dramatic. While donors, faculty, and students continued their scheduled weekend activities, an emergency session of the university's executive leadership team was convened in President Chen's office. The atmosphere was tense as Thompson sat at the far end of the conference table, feeling the weight of every glance directed his way. The Walker incident has created a significant crisis, President Chen began, her normally warm demeanor replaced by professional gravity. Beyond the potential loss of a major research partnership, we're facing questions about the integrity of our admissions process and the alignment between our stated values and our actual practices. The Vice President for Development, Jonathan Parker, looked particularly stricken. 3 major donors have already contacted my office expressing concern. The Marshall Foundation has explicitly asked for assurance that their scholarship funds are being distributed based on genuine merit, not socioeconomic background or connections. Social media is already amplifying the story, added the director of communications, sliding printouts across the table. The video clip of Dr. Walker quoting Dean Thompson has over 200,000 views since yesterday. Several higher education blogs are preparing pieces on elitism in selective admissions. Thompson cleared his throat. I want to emphasize that my conversation with Miss Walker, while perhaps poorly phrased, was based on our established admissions criteria. We've always maintained that. That's precisely the issue, Richard, President Chen interrupted, her voice firm, but not unkind. If our established criteria systematically exclude brilliant students from non-traditional backgrounds, then we need to examine those criteria, not defend them. Dr. Eliza Harper, the provost, had been reviewing Emma Walker's complete application. She looked up with a frown. I've reviewed this application thoroughly. Ms. Walker's credentials are exceptional by any measure. Her research publication has been cited 17 times in the past year. Professor Rodriguez wrote in his recommendation that she's precisely the kind of innovative thinker our environmental science program needs. I cannot see any academic justification for her rejection. The admissions committee thought her extracurricular profile didn't demonstrate the kind of leadership potential Thompson began. She founded a regional student coalition that successfully lobbied for sustainable agriculture education in 5 county school systems. The provost interrupted, reading from the file. She led her science team to national finals. She created an internship program connecting rural students with agricultural research opportunities. She looked up. If that doesn't demonstrate leadership, I'm not clear on what would. President Chen sighed deeply. We need to address this directly and immediately. First, I want a comprehensive review of our admissions practices, particularly how we evaluate applicants from backgrounds different from our traditional demographic. Second, we need to reach out to Dr. Walker to acknowledge the situation and request an opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to reform. Third, we should establish a task force to examine institutional biases across all our programs and departments. And Dean Thompson? Asked the board chair, who had joined the meeting by secure video link. All eyes turned to Thompson, who sat straighter, feeling the weight of his 20-year career at Westridge hanging in the balance. Richard will lead the admissions review, President Chen said, surprising everyone in the room, including Thompson himself. No one knows our current system better, and therefore no one is better positioned to identify its flaws and recommend changes. As the meeting adjourned, President Chen asked Thompson to remain behind. When they were alone, she fixed him with a searching gaze. I'm giving you an opportunity here, Richard, both professionally and personally. You can approach this as a bureaucratic exercise to weather a public relations storm, or you can use it as a genuine chance to examine assumptions that may have limited both our institution and your own perspective. Thompson met her gaze. Why trust me with this? Many would expect you to ask for my resignation. Because scapegoating you wouldn't solve the underlying problem, she replied. The issue isn't one admissions dean or one rejected student. It's a culture that has developed over generations, equating certain backgrounds with merit and others with limitation. She paused. Besides, I've known you for 8 years. You genuinely care about educational excellence. I believe when you see the evidence clearly, you'll make the right recommendations, regardless of how uncomfortable they might be. After leaving the president's office, Thompson didn't return to the admissions building. Instead, he found himself walking across campus, seeing it with new eyes. The manicured perfection of the grounds, the Gothic architecture intended to evoke ancient European universities, the subtle but pervasive signals of exclusivity, all of it suddenly seemed less like academic excellence and more like carefully constructed theater. He paused near the science complex where Emma Walker's research would have found a home. Through the windows, he could see students in a laboratory, working on experiments under a professor's guidance. How many Emma Walkers had his office turned away over the years? How many brilliant minds had been rejected, not because they lacked potential, but because they didn't fit a narrowly defined mold of what a Westridge student should look and sound like? By the time he reached his office, Thompson had made a decision. Rather than delegating the data gathering for the admissions review as he might normally have done, he would conduct the initial analysis himself. He began by pulling files of rejected applicants with exceptional academic credentials from the past 5 years, particularly focusing on those from rural communities, inner-city schools, and working-class backgrounds. The pattern that emerged was undeniable and deeply troubling. Applicants from non-traditional backgrounds were consistently held to higher academic standards than those from preparatory academies and affluent suburbs. Achievements were weighted differently based on where they occurred. A leadership position at an elite prep school was valued more highly than founding a community organization in a rural town. Recommendation letters from well-known institutions received more consideration than equally glowing evaluations from less prestigious schools. Most concerning was the personality score component of Westridge's evaluation system, where subjective assessments of an applicant's fit with the university's culture became the deciding factor for many borderline cases. Applicants from backgrounds similar to existing Westridge students consistently received higher personality scores, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of demographic homogeneity. Thompson worked late into the evening, the stack of files growing. On his desk, the evidence of systemic bias becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. When Professor Rodriguez knocked on his door around 9 o'clock, Thompson actually welcomed the interruption. "I heard about the emergency meeting," Rodriguez said, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. "How bad is it?" "Professionally, it's the most challenging situation I've faced in 20 years at Westridge," Thompson admitted. "Personally, it's forcing me to question assumptions I've held my entire career." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. That kind of questioning can be valuable, though rarely comfortable. "I keep coming back to Emma Walker," Thompson said, gesturing to her file on his desk. "I didn't even seriously consider her application. Not really. I saw rural farming community and agricultural research and immediately placed her in a mental category of not Westridge material, despite evidence to the contrary right in front of me." "It's not just you," Rodriguez offered. "Higher education has developed a deeply ingrained hierarchy of value. Theoretical work over practical applications, urban perspectives over rural ones, established pathways over innovative approaches. We claim to value diversity of thought, while systematically excluding the very perspectives that might most challenge our assumptions." Thompson considered this. The irony is that some of our most successful alumni built their careers by bridging exactly those divides, applying theoretical knowledge to practical problems, connecting different worlds and perspectives. Like Emma's research, Rodriguez pointed out, her soil regeneration technique combines advanced biochemistry with generations of practical agricultural knowledge. It's precisely the kind of bridge-building innovation we claim to value. Yet I dismissed it without serious consideration, Thompson acknowledged. "So what happens now?" Rodriguez asked. Thompson gestured to the file surrounding him. "Now I prepare an honest assessment of our admissions practices and recommend specific reforms. Not just cosmetic changes to weather this particular storm, but fundamental reconsideration of how we define and recognize potential, merit, and excellence." "That won't be popular with everyone," Rodriguez warned. "There are powerful constituencies invested in the current system, legacy families, traditional donors, even some faculty who believe exclusivity equates to quality." "I'm aware," Thompson replied, "but maintaining a flawed system to avoid difficult conversations isn't leadership, it's cowardice." Rodriguez smiled slightly, surprised by Thompson's candor. "You might find unexpected allies. Many of us have been advocating for these changes for years." After Rodriguez left, Thompson returned to his analysis, working until midnight documenting patterns and preparing preliminary recommendations. When he finally drove home, his mind was still racing with implications, not just for Westridge, but for his own understanding of merit and potential. The comfortable certainty that had defined his professional identity for decades had been shaken to its core, and the process of rebuilding would be neither quick nor easy. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the final day of the donor. Weekend still proceeding according to schedule despite the underlying tension. Thompson arrived early to find President Chen waiting in his office, reviewing some of the files he had analyzed the previous night. "I see you've been thorough," she observed as he entered. "It seemed necessary," he replied, setting down his briefcase. "The patterns are too consistent to ignore." "Dr. Walker has agreed to meet with us this afternoon," Chen said, changing the subject. "She and Emma are still on campus. They're participating in a roundtable discussion on agricultural sustainability with our environmental science faculty this morning." Thompson nodded, unsurprised that Rodriguez and his colleagues had seized the opportunity to engage with the Walkers professionally, regardless of the admissions controversy. "What are you hoping to accomplish in the meeting?" "That depends partly on you," Chen replied. "I've invited you to join us, but I want to be clear about your approach. This isn't about damage control or public relations. It's about demonstrating that we're capable of honest self-assessment and meaningful change." "I understand," Thompson said. "I spent most of yesterday evening examining not just our processes, but my own role in perpetuating a system that confuses privilege with potential. I'm prepared to acknowledge that directly." Chen studied him carefully. "That level of self-reflection isn't common, Richard. Most people in your position would be focused on self-preservation." "Perhaps that's part of the problem," he replied. "We've created an institutional culture that values reputation management over genuine improvement." The meeting with the Walkers was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the President's conference room. Thompson arrived early, reviewing his notes and preparing himself for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. Dr. Walker arrived precisely on time, accompanied by Emma and, somewhat surprisingly, Professor Rodriguez. "Thank you for making time to meet with us," President Chen began, after introductions were complete. "I want to begin by acknowledging that Emma's experience with our admissions process revealed shortcomings in our approach that require serious attention." Dr. Walker nodded, her expression professional but reserved. "I appreciate your willingness to engage directly with the issue. To be clear, I'm not here seeking special treatment for Emma. She's made her college decision and is excited about Stanford's program. I'm here because your institution has expressed interest in a research partnership with Walker AgriTech, and I need to understand whether Westridge's commitment to innovation is genuine or merely rhetorical." "A fair question," Chen acknowledged. "I've asked Dean Thompson to share his preliminary findings from our admissions review, which began immediately after your conversation yesterday." Thompson took a deep breath, acutely aware of Emma's presence across the table. "Dr. Walker, Emma," he began, meeting their eyes directly, "I want to start with a personal apology. My dismissal of Emma's application, and particularly my comments during our meeting last week, reflected biases that I hadn't previously recognized or acknowledged. There was no legitimate academic reason for Emma's rejection from Westridge. Emma studied him thoughtfully but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Beyond my personal failure in this specific case," Thompson continued, "I've identified systemic issues in our admissions process that have effectively excluded many qualified students from backgrounds unlike our traditional demographic." He outlined the patterns he had discovered, from the inconsistent application of academic standards to the subjective personality assessments that favored applicants from familiar backgrounds. Most concerning, he concluded, is that these practices directly contradict our stated institutional values of innovation, diverse perspectives, and merit-based opportunity. We've been operating two parallel systems: our public commitment to excellence regardless of background, and our internal practices that define excellence in ways that perpetuate privilege. Dr. Walker leaned forward slightly. "What do you propose to do about these findings? I'm preparing a comprehensive reform proposal, Thompson replied. It includes anonymous first-round application reviews to reduce demographic bias, expanded definitions of excellence and leadership that recognize achievement in diverse contexts, and restructuring of our evaluation metrics to identify potential rather than privilege. He paused, then added, I'm also recommending the creation of a specific outreach program for rural and agricultural communities, partnering with organizations like 4-H and FFA to identify students whose innovations might otherwise go unrecognized by traditional recruitment channels. The Rural Innovation Scholars Program, President Chen added. We envision it as a pathway not just for student recruitment, but for institutional learning, a way for Westridge to engage with knowledge systems and approaches we've traditionally overlooked. Emma spoke for the first time. What would prevent these changes from becoming superficial, a temporary response to negative publicity rather than genuine transformation? It was a perceptive question that went to the heart of institutional change. Thompson appreciated her directness. Transparency and accountability, he replied. We're establishing specific demographic goals for the next 5 incoming classes, with quarterly public reporting on our progress. The admissions staff is being restructured to include perspectives from non-traditional educational backgrounds. And perhaps most importantly, we're incorporating these commitments into our accreditation framework, making them binding requirements for our continued operation. Professor Rodriguez added, we're also expanding the definition of merit in our faculty hiring and promotion practices, recognizing that the same biases that affected student admissions have limited the diversity of thought within our faculty. Dr. Walker considered this information carefully. These are significant commitments, she acknowledged. What prompted this level of self-examination rather than a more limited response? President Chen glanced at Thompson before answering. Honestly, the clarity of the evidence and the willingness of key leaders like Dean Thompson to acknowledge fundamental flaws rather than superficial problems. It's relatively easy to attribute a single bad decision to individual error. It's much harder, but ultimately more valuable, to recognize when that error reflects systemic issues. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, evolving from critique to constructive dialogue about how institutions like Westridge could genuinely bridge theoretical knowledge with practical innovation. By the time they concluded, the atmosphere had transformed from tense confrontation to cautious collaboration. Walker AgriTech remains committed to our partnership with Cornell, Dr. Walker clarified as the meeting ended. That decision was made before this situation developed. However, I'm impressed by Westridge's response to this challenge. I'd like to explore the possibility of including Westridge in our cross-institutional research network, which connects our primary university partners with other institutions doing complementary work. We would welcome that opportunity, President Chen replied, and would be particularly interested in creating research pathways for students from backgrounds similar to Emma's. As they prepared to leave, Emma approached Thompson directly. Dean Thompson, she said, her voice measured, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge both the personal and systemic issues involved in my rejection. That level of honesty can't have been easy. It wasn't, he admitted. But it was necessary, not just for Westridge's institutional integrity, but for my own professional growth. Your experience forced me to confront limitations in my understanding of excellence and potential that I might otherwise never have recognized. I hope the reforms you're proposing create opportunities for students who might otherwise be overlooked, Emma said. There are brilliant minds solving complex problems in communities rarely represented at institutions like Westridge. I'm beginning to understand that, Thompson replied. and I'm grateful, however uncomfortable the process has been, for the opportunity to expand my perspective. As the walkers departed, Thompson found himself standing with President Chen and Professor Rodriguez, watching the mother and daughter cross the quad toward the science complex, where Emma would participate in one final research discussion before their departure. "She's remarkable," Thompson observed. "Stanford is fortunate to have her." "Yes," Chen agreed, "and we're fortunate that her rejection became visible enough to force institutional reflection. How many other brilliant students have we lost over the years without ever recognizing what we were missing?" It was a sobering question, one that would guide Thompson's work in the months ahead as he led the transformation of Westridge's approach to identifying and nurturing excellence in all its diverse manifestations. The weeks following Dr. Walker's dramatic arrival at Westridge brought profound changes to the university. What had begun as an embarrassing confrontation quickly evolved into a fundamental reassessment of the institution's values and practices. For Dean Richard Thompson, the transformation was both professional and personal, beginning with the most uncomfortable meeting of his career. 3 days after the private jet incident, Thompson found himself sitting in President Chen's office, surrounded by members of the university's Board of Trustees. The atmosphere was tense, the expressions around the polished conference table uniformly grave. "Dean Thompson," the president began, her normally warm demeanor replaced by careful formality, "our preliminary review of the Walker case has identified concerning patterns in our admissions practices. Of the 428 students admitted to next year's freshman class, only 12 come from rural communities, despite receiving applications from over 300 highly qualified rural students." Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his suit, acutely aware that his usual authoritative presence held no power in this room. "Those numbers are the result of objective evaluations, not deliberate exclusions," he insisted. "Our holistic review process considers many factors beyond academics, which is precisely why we need to examine what those many factors actually are," interrupted Dr. Eleanor Maxwell, a senior board member and respected sociologist. "When unstated biases drive supposedly objective processes, we end up with homogeneous student bodies that reflect preference rather than potential." Thompson nodded mechanically, understanding the precarious position he now occupied. The board could terminate his employment immediately, ending 2 decades of carefully constructed career advancement in a single afternoon. "We're not here to determine your future with Westridge today, Dean Thompson," the president continued, as if reading his thoughts. "We're here to address systemic issues in our admissions approach. The Walker incident has exposed blind spots that require immediate attention. What stung most wasn't the implied threat of discipline, but the realization that his professional reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, was now tarnished. The exclusive excellence he had prioritized appeared hollow when measured against the genuine innovation and real-world impact someone like Emma Walker represented. "The incident has attracted significant media attention," noted the university's public relations director. Walker AgriTech Solutions released a statement yesterday announcing their new $25 million partnership with Cornell University for their Rural Innovation Fellows program. "Several major donors have contacted us with concerns about our commitment to true academic meritocracy." As the meeting concluded, President Chen remained behind, fixing Thompson with a searching gaze. "Richard, we've worked together for 8 years. I've always valued your commitment to excellence, but I'm struggling to understand how someone with Emma Walker's credentials was dismissed so categorically." Thompson managed a tight nod. "I made assumptions based on her background that I now recognize were unfounded." "It goes deeper than that," Chen replied. "Our institutional values statement claims we seek diverse perspectives and innovative thinking. Yet our admissions practices seem designed to produce students who think and look remarkably alike. She paused. The board has approved a comprehensive review of our admissions criteria to be led by an external consultant with expertise in educational access and equity. The comment stayed with Thompson as he walked back to his office, the familiar campus suddenly appearing different through newly critical eyes. For the first time in his career, he really looked at the student body he had helped create, not assessing their prestige value, but seeing the homogeneity that had become Westridge's defining characteristic, despite its claims of valuing diversity. The following morning, Thompson made a decision. Instead of delegating the preliminary data gathering for the admissions review, he pulled the files himself, beginning with rejected applicants who had exceptional academic credentials, but came from backgrounds unlike those traditionally represented at Westridge. What he discovered was disturbing. The pattern went far beyond Emma Walker. Dozens of brilliant students from rural communities, inner-city schools, or working-class backgrounds had been rejected despite academic achievements that equaled or surpassed many admitted students from more privileged backgrounds. Sitting amid the growing stacks of files in his office after hours, Thompson confronted an uncomfortable truth. He had been the architect of a system that confused privilege with potential, that valued polished presentation over genuine substance, that mistook familiarity for excellence. A knock at his open door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Professor Rodriguez from the Environmental Science Department standing in the doorway. "Working late, Dean Thompson?" he asked, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Reviewing some admissions data," Thompson replied, gesturing to the files surrounding him. "You were right about Emma Walker. Her research was exceptional. I should have recognized that." Rodriguez entered and took a seat across from his desk. "May I speak frankly?" Thompson nodded, too exhausted for the usual administrative facades. "Westridge has incredible resources and tremendous potential," Rodriguez said, "but we've developed blind spots that limit what we could become. For years, those of us in applied sciences have watched as theoretical work received preferential funding and recognition, while practical innovation was subtly dismissed as less intellectually rigorous. Like agricultural science," Thompson acknowledged. "Exactly. We've created artificial hierarchies of knowledge, placing abstract theory above practical application, urban perspectives above rural ones, traditional academic pathways above innovative ones." He leaned forward. "The irony is that the most groundbreaking work often happens at the intersection of these different approaches." Thompson considered this. Like Emma Walker's research, combining theoretical models with practical field testing. Precisely. The next generation of innovation will come from people who can bridge different worlds. Academic rigor with real-world application, traditional knowledge with cutting-edge technology. Rodriguez gestured toward the files, and we've been systematically excluding many of those potential bridge builders because they don't fit our narrow image of what a Westridge student should be. The conversation continued for over an hour, evolving from critique to constructive ideas for reform. By the time Professor Rodriguez left his office, something fundamental had shifted in Thompson's perspective. Excellence was no longer a narrow path defined by traditional markers of prestige, but a diverse landscape of possibilities he had previously failed to recognize. Over the following months, Westridge's admissions office underwent a profound transformation. Working with the external consultants, Thompson led a complete restructuring of the evaluation process. Anonymous application reviews removed name and background information that might trigger bias. Evaluation criteria were expanded to recognize different forms of excellence that had previously been overlooked or undervalued. Most significantly, The admissions team itself was diversified to include perspectives that could recognize potential in unfamiliar forms. Initially, some traditional donors and alumni expressed concern about lowering standards, but these objections faded as early results demonstrated that the new approach was actually raising the bar for genuine academic excellence while simultaneously broadening access. Students admitted under the reformed criteria brought fresh perspectives and approaches that energized classroom discussions and research projects. 6 months after Dr. Walker's private jet had disrupted the campus, Westridge hosted an educational innovation conference focusing on bridging academic theory with practical application. Speakers included leaders from agriculture, urban development, public health, and technology, fields where real-world impact depended on translating theoretical knowledge into practical solutions. In the university's Grand Hall, Dean Thompson found himself introducing a panel on recognizing excellence beyond traditional metrics. As he surveyed the diverse audience of educators, researchers, and industry leaders, he reflected on how dramatically his own metrics had evolved. 6 months ago, he began with unusual candor, I would have defined excellence through a narrow set of traditional achievements. Today, Westridge is learning to recognize that true innovation often emerges from unexpected sources and unconventional pathways. The audience included both President Chen and Professor Rodriguez, who nodded in appreciation of his public acknowledgement of the institution's ongoing transformation. Also present, somewhat surprisingly, were Dr. Sarah Walker and her daughter, Emma, who had accepted Westridge's invitation to participate in a panel on agricultural innovation. After the formal sessions concluded, Thompson approached the Walkers during the reception. The moment was uncomfortable, but necessary. Dr. Walker, Emma, he began, I want to thank you for accepting our invitation, despite our previous interaction. Your presence adds tremendous value to this conversation. Dr. Walker nodded politely, her expression reserved, but not hostile. Westridge's efforts to reform its approach are commendable. When President Chen reached out personally to explain the changes being implemented, we felt it was worth engaging with that process. Turning to Emma, Thompson continued with genuine humility. I owe you a particular apology, Emma. My dismissal of your achievements and background reflected biases I hadn't recognized in myself. Your research deserved serious consideration, regardless of where it was conducted. Emma studied him thoughtfully. Thank you for saying that, Dean Thompson. I'm genuinely impressed by Westridge's willingness to examine its practices so thoroughly. Are you finding Stanford's program a good fit for your work? Thompson asked, remembering that Stanford and Cornell had both accepted her. Very much so, Emma replied. Their approach to environmental science combines rigorous theory with practical application, which aligns perfectly with my interests. But I'm also collaborating with students here at Westridge through Professor Rodriguez's new cross-institutional research initiative. This was news to Thompson. Cross-institutional research? Yes, Dr. Walker explained. While our primary partnership went to Cornell, we've established a smaller grant for collaborative research between Westridge, Cornell, Stanford, and several land-grant universities. Professor Rodriguez is coordinating Westridge's participation. President Chen joined their conversation, adding, the initiative is already yielding impressive results. Students from different institutional cultures bringing complementary perspectives to complex agricultural challenges. As they continued discussing the emerging collaboration, Thompson recognized the elegant solution the Walkers had crafted, not excluding Westridge entirely, but creating a structure that required the university to engage with institutions and approaches it had previously dismissed. It was both a generous second chance and a subtle mechanism for ensuring continued reform. Later that evening, as the conference reception wound down, Thompson found himself standing alone with President Chen, watching as faculty and visitors engaged in animated conversations across the hall. "Different energy than our usual events," he observed. Chen nodded. "More dynamic, more diverse perspectives. The conversations have substance beyond networking and prestige signaling." She turned to him directly. "You've handled this transition admirably, Richard. Many in your position would have resisted or resigned." "I considered it," he admitted, "but that would have been running from a problem I helped create. The truth is, I'm finding this new approach to identifying and nurturing excellence far more interesting than our previous model." "As are our faculty and students," Chen replied. "Applications for next year are up 24%, with significant increases from demographics we've historically underrepresented. And counter to some fears, our academic metrics are strengthening, not weakening." Across the room, Emma Walker was engaged in animated conversation with several Westridge students and faculty, her passion for agricultural innovation evident in her gestures and expression. Watching her, Thompson felt a complex mixture of regret for his earlier dismissal and appreciation for the institutional transformation that dismissal had ultimately triggered. "She would have contributed so much to our community," Thompson said quietly. "She still is," Chen pointed out, "just not in the way either of us would have predicted. Sometimes our greatest impact comes from challenging systems rather than joining them." As the evening concluded, Thompson reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The administrator who had once dismissed rural agricultural expertise as inherently less valuable than traditional academic credentials now recognized that innovation thrived at the intersection of different knowledge systems. His definition of excellence had expanded beyond recognition, incorporating forms of achievement and potential he had previously been blind to. And it had all begun with a moment of humiliation on the university airstrip, a private jet bearing the logo of a company he had never bothered to research, and his own willingness to grow beyond limitations toward a more comprehensive understanding of what excellence truly meant. 5 years later, the Westridge Center for Inclusive Excellence opened its doors on a perfect autumn morning, with maple trees blazing red and gold across the transformed campus. The renovated Georgian building that once housed the exclusive Founders Club now served as the home for programs designed to identify and nurture talent from underrepresented backgrounds. Its stately columns and historic facade remained, but inside, modern collaborative spaces and advanced technology created an environment where innovation flourished. Outside, a diverse crowd gathered for the dedication ceremony. Students whose backgrounds spanned rural communities to urban centers, faculty members who had embraced the institutional transformation, alumni who had initially resisted change, but now championed it, and educational leaders from across the country who had come to study what many now called the Westridge model. President Patricia Chen, now in her final year before retirement, approached the podium set up on the building's wide steps. At 66, her distinguished appearance had only been enhanced by the wisdom gained through navigating institutional change. "Welcome, everyone, to what I believe represents not just Westridge's future, but a new vision for higher education in America," she began, her voice carrying across the attentive crowd. 5 years ago, our institution faced a moment of reckoning when our stated values of excellence and innovation were revealed to be far narrower in practice than in principle. In the front row, Dean Richard Thompson sat with quiet composure. At 61, he had transformed from a guardian of tradition to one of the most respected voices in educational access reform, his journey from exclusivity to inclusivity having become a case study in leadership adaptation. Beside him sat Professor Rodriguez, now the acclaimed director of Westridge's thriving Agricultural Innovation Institute, which had become a national model for connecting academic research with practical application. Today, President Chen continued, the Center for Inclusive Excellence stands as testament to what happens when an institution has the courage to examine its biases, the wisdom to recognize overlooked forms of potential, and the commitment to build systems that truly serve our educational mission rather than merely perpetuating privilege. The journey from crisis to transformation had not been simple or linear. After the initial reforms to Westridge's admissions practices, deeper systemic issues had emerged throughout the institution. Academic departments had confronted implicit hierarchies that privileged certain forms of knowledge over others. Financial aid systems that inadvertently favored students from wealthy backgrounds had been restructured. Faculty hiring practices had been reformed to recognize excellence in diverse forms rather than through narrow traditional pathways. President Chen gestured toward Dean Thompson and the leadership team seated in the front row. I want to acknowledge the courage it takes to lead change from within, to recognize when long-held assumptions no longer serve our highest purpose, and to rebuild systems with greater integrity and vision. Westridge's transformation began with a confrontation that could have ended with defensiveness and denial. Instead, it became a catalyst for institutional renewal. The crowd applauded as Dean Thompson nodded in acknowledgement, his former embarrassment having transformed into a kind of quiet pride in the difficult journey Westridge had undertaken. The university's commitment to genuine excellence had not diminished. In fact, by most academic metrics, it had strengthened considerably. What had changed was how that excellence was identified, nurtured, and expressed. After Westridge's initial reforms to its admissions criteria, other elite institutions had watched with skepticism, predicting a decline in academic standards and reputational standing. But as the university's research output increased, student achievements multiplied, and postgraduate outcomes improved across all measures, that skepticism had gradually transformed into interest. What began as one institution's crisis response had evolved into a movement that was changing how excellence was defined throughout higher education. The inclusive excellence framework we celebrate today, President Chen explained, recognizes that innovation thrives at the intersection of different perspectives, that academic rigor is strengthened rather than diminished by diverse approaches to knowledge, and that institutions truly committed to excellence must continually examine who they include and exclude from opportunity. As part of the ceremony, the university unveiled its newly established Emma Walker Fellows Program, designed to identify brilliant students from rural communities whose innovative approaches to agricultural and environmental challenges represented the kind of bridge building between theory and application that had become Westridge's hallmark. And in a moment that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier, Emma Walker herself, now Dr. Emma Walker, having completed her PhD at Stanford with groundbreaking research in sustainable agriculture, stepped to the podium as the program's honorary first fellow. When I was rejected by Westridge 5 years ago, she began with characteristic directness. It wasn't just a personal disappointment, but a symptom of how higher education often fails to recognize innovation that comes in unfamiliar forms or from unexpected places. The audience, including many who had been part of that original admission system, listened with remarkable openness to her candid assessment. What Westridge has accomplished since then isn't merely about correcting a mistaken rejection or becoming more diverse for diversity's sake, she continued. It's about recognizing that excellence takes many forms, that innovation often happens at the boundaries between different worlds, and that the most pressing challenges facing humanity require collaboration across traditional divides. After the formal dedication ceremony, as attendees explored the new center, Dean Thompson found himself approached by a young woman in her first year at Westridge, a student from a small farming community in Nebraska who had been admitted through the reformed admissions process. Dean Thompson, the student began somewhat nervously. "I wanted to thank you personally. My high school counselor told me not to bother applying to Westridge, that they never accepted students like me, but then she attended one of your outreach workshops and changed her mind." Thompson smiled, remembering the extensive work his team had done to reach counselors in rural and underserved communities. "What's your field of study?" "Environmental engineering with a focus on water conservation technologies," the student replied, her confidence growing as she spoke about her passion. "I've been working with irrigation systems on my family's farm since I was 14, and I've developed some modifications that improve efficiency by nearly 35%. Professor Rodriguez is helping me formalize the research so we can publish it." Listening to the student's enthusiastic explanation of her innovations, Thompson was struck by how similar she sounded to Emma Walker 5 years earlier, and how differently Westridge now responded to such talent. Where once the institution might have dismissed practical innovation as less valuable than theoretical work, it now recognized the powerful potential in students who bridged different worlds. Later that afternoon, at the reception following the dedication, Thompson found himself standing with Dr. Sarah Walker, who had returned to campus for the ceremony. Now in her early 50s, Dr. Walker had become an even more influential figure in agricultural innovation, her company's technologies helping farmers worldwide adapt to changing climate conditions. "Quite a transformation," she observed, gesturing toward the diverse gathering of students, faculty, and visitors engaged in animated conversations throughout the reception hall, not just in demographics, but in energy and purpose. Thompson nodded. "The changes went far deeper than I initially imagined possible. What began as reforms to our admissions process ultimately led us to re-examine every aspect of how we define and nurture excellence, and strengthened your institution in the process," Dr. Walker noted. "Westridge's research output in sustainable technologies has increased dramatically. Several of our recent innovations at Walker AgriTech began as collaborative projects with your faculty and students." This was true. After the initial confrontation, Walker AgriTech had indeed directed its major partnership to Cornell. But over time, as Westridge demonstrated genuine commitment to reform, the company had gradually increased its engagement with the university. What began as a small grant for cross-institutional research had evolved into significant research partnerships that benefited both the institution and the company. "Your arrival with that private jet could have been the beginning of the end for my career," Thompson acknowledged with surprising candor. "Instead, it became the catalyst for the most meaningful work I've done in education." Dr. Walker studied him thoughtfully. Institutional change rarely happens without some form of disruption. What matters is how leadership responds to that disruption, with defensiveness or with growth. As the celebration continued into the evening, Thompson observed a moment that perfectly encapsulated Westridge's transformation. In one corner of the reception hall, Emma Walker was engaged in animated conversation with the university's most recent Rhodes Scholar, a young man from Appalachia whose research, combining traditional ecological knowledge with cutting-edge data analysis, had earned international recognition. They were joined by 3 current students, 2 faculty members, and a visiting researcher from Walker AgriTech, all focused intently on solving a complex problem related to water conservation in drought conditions. What struck Thompson most was the complete absence of hierarchy in their interaction. The Rhodes Scholar listened with genuine interest as a first-year student explained her observations from her family farm. Emma built on those insights with data from her Stanford research. The faculty members offered theoretical frameworks that might explain the patterns they were discussing. The Walker AgriTech researcher contributed practical considerations about implementation at scale. This was Westridge's new definition of excellence in action, collaborative rather than competitive, valuing diverse forms of knowledge, connecting theory with application, and recognizing that innovation thrives at the intersection of different perspectives. As the event concluded, President Chen joined Thompson as he prepared to leave. "I've been meaning to tell you," she said, "the board has unanimously approved your appointment as my successor when I retire next year. They believe your leadership of our transformation makes you uniquely qualified to guide Westridge's next chapter." The news was both surprising and deeply affirming. "I'm honored by their confidence," Thompson replied, genuinely moved, "though I can't help but appreciate the irony, given how close I came to resigning in disgrace 5 years ago." "The best leaders aren't those who never make mistakes," Chen observed. "They're those who have the courage to learn from them and the vision to build something better as a result." As Thompson drove home that evening, he reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 5 years. The administrator who had once defined excellence through narrow traditional metrics now championed a vision of education that recognized brilliance in its many forms. The system he had once defended as meritocratic, he now understood had been anything but, confusing privilege with potential and familiarity with quality. Most importantly, he had learned that true institutional excellence wasn't measured by exclusivity or prestige, but by the ability to identify and nurture talent in all its diverse manifestations. To be a place where a brilliant young woman from a farming background with innovative ideas about sustainable agriculture would be welcomed and celebrated rather than dismissed. And it had all begun with a humiliating confrontation on the university airstrip, a sleek private jet demonstrating the power and sophistication of modern agricultural technology and his own willingness to grow beyond comfortable assumptions toward a more genuine understanding of excellence. A transformation that had not only saved his career, but had given it meaning beyond anything he had previously imagined possible. As Westridge prepared to welcome its most diverse and academically accomplished class in university history, the private jet that had once seemed like an embarrassing disruption had become part of institutional law, not as a moment of shame, but as the catalyst for a transformation that had made Westridge a national model for how elite institutions could maintain rigorous standards while dramatically expanding their definition of who could meet those standards and what forms excellence might take. The rural student who had been told, "We cultivate global leaders, not local farmers," had helped Westridge discover that true leadership flourished precisely when artificial boundaries between different forms of knowledge were removed. When theoretical brilliance engaged with practical innovation, when academic tradition met real-world challenges, and when an institution had the courage to recognize that excellence might arrive in forms it had previously failed to see. 10 years later, the National Conference on Inclusive Excellence in Higher Education buzzed with energy as educational leaders from across the globe gathered to exchange ideas about transforming institutional cultures and practices. The grand ballroom of the Washington Convention Center was filled to capacity for the keynote address, a presentation on what had become known as the Westridge Revolution and its ripple effects throughout American education. At the podium stood Dr. Richard Thompson, now in his final year as president of Westridge University and recently named the incoming chair of the American Council on Education. At 66, his presence carried the gravitas of someone who had not only led institutional transformation, but had become its most compelling advocate across the higher education landscape. 10 years ago, he began, his voice carrying confidently through the packed hall. A private jet bearing the logo of an agricultural technology company I had never bothered to research landed on my institution's airstrip and forced us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that our definition of excellence was not only narrow, but fundamentally flawed, confusing privilege with potential and familiarity with quality. In the front row sat Dr. Emma Walker, now 28, and a rising star in sustainable agricultural technology. After completing her Stanford doctorate, she had established the Rural Innovation Network, connecting brilliant young innovators from agricultural communities with research institutions and technology companies. Beside her sat her mother, Dr. Sarah Walker, whose dramatic intervention a decade earlier had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond one university or one rejected student. What began as a crisis for Westridge, President Thompson continued, evolved into a movement that has transformed how we think about merit, potential, and the very purpose of higher education. Today, over 300 institutions have implemented some version of what began as the Westridge model, and the results speak for themselves. The screen behind him displayed compelling data. Research output across participating institutions had increased by an average of 35%. Patent applications had risen by 42%. Most significantly, graduates from these institutions were demonstrating exceptional success in addressing complex real-world challenges, from climate adaptation to healthcare access to sustainable food systems. The evidence is clear, Thompson noted, gesturing toward the data. When institutions expand their definition of excellence beyond traditional markers of privilege, when they recognize brilliance in its many forms, they don't sacrifice quality. They enhance it dramatically. The journey from Westridge's transformation to broader educational reform had not been straightforward. After the initial success of their institutional changes, Thompson and his team had been invited to share their approach at regional educational conferences. What began as presentations about admissions reform gradually expanded into comprehensive workshops on recognizing and nurturing diverse forms of excellence throughout academic institutions. Initially, other elite universities had maintained a skeptical distance, viewing Westridge's approach as a potential dilution of standards. But as the data on student outcomes, research innovation, and postgraduate success accumulated, skepticism had gradually given way to curiosity and, eventually, to emulation. The most powerful evidence for this approach, Thompson explained to the assembled educators, comes not just from institutional metrics, but from the kinds of solutions our graduates are generating for complex global challenges. When we bring together students with diverse perspectives, knowledge systems, and life experiences, they develop approaches that simply wouldn't emerge from homogeneous groups with similar backgrounds. He clicked to the next slide, which showcased several groundbreaking innovations that had emerged from Westridge's transformed academic environment. A water conservation system developed by a team led by a student from a drought-prone farming region. A community healthcare delivery model created by students who had experienced rural medical access challenges firsthand. A sustainable housing design that combined cutting-edge materials, science with traditional building practices from various cultures. These innovations share a common feature, Thompson noted. They all emerge from teams that included students who would have been rejected by our previous admission system. Not because they lacked brilliance, but because their brilliance came in forms we had been trained not to recognize. After the keynote address, the conference broke into specialized sessions, including one led by Dr. Emma Walker on rural innovation as a catalyst for technological advancement. Her session attracted education leaders alongside representatives from major technology companies and research institutions who had come to understand the competitive advantage of engaging with knowledge systems previously marginalized in academic settings. The most significant innovations in agricultural technology over the past decade, Emma explained to her packed session, have emerged at the intersection of advanced data science and generations of practical farming knowledge. When we bridge these worlds instead of privileging one over the other, we develop solutions that are both theoretically sound and practically implementable. Her approach had not just influenced educational institutions, but had transformed how major agricultural technology companies identified and developed talent. Walker AgriTech had established the Rural Innovation Talent Pipeline, recruiting brilliant young people from farming communities who demonstrated exceptional problem-solving abilities, regardless of their traditional academic credentials. Other companies had followed suit, recognizing that conventional recruiting, focused almost exclusively on prestigious institutions, had caused them to miss extraordinary talent from underrepresented backgrounds. In another conference room, a panel discussion on redefining merit in selective institutions featured admissions directors from several elite universities that had followed Westridge's lead in reforming their evaluation processes. The conversation focused not on lowering standards, but on developing more sophisticated and accurate methods for identifying potential excellence in diverse forms. The traditional markers we relied on, standardized tests, AP courses, extracurricular, activities available primarily at wealthy schools, were never truly meritocratic, explained the admissions director from a prestigious East Coast university. They measured privilege and access as much as ability and potential. The Westridge model has given us tools to see past those limitations, to identify genuine brilliance wherever it exists. During the conference luncheon, President Thompson found himself seated with education leaders from rural states who had seen dramatic changes in how their students were perceived by elite institutions. Before Westridge started this movement, noted a superintendent from Iowa, I had brilliant students who didn't even bother applying to selective universities because they assumed, usually correctly, that their rural background would count against them, regardless of their achievements. Now, those same students are being actively recruited by those institutions, which recognize the unique perspectives they bring. Similar stories echoed around the table. Accounts of students whose exceptional talents had previously been overlooked or dismissed because they didn't fit traditional profiles of elite college material. As admissions practices had evolved, these students were increasingly finding their way to institutions where they could develop their abilities at the highest levels. As the conference continued into its second day, attendees toured the newly established National Center for Inclusive Excellence, a research and advocacy organization dedicated to expanding educational access and redefining merit across all levels of education. The center's main hall featured interactive displays showcasing the data behind the transformation movement, demonstrating how expanding access had strengthened rather than weakened institutional outcomes across all conventional metrics. President Thompson paused before a display that tracked the 10-year journey from Westridge's crisis to national movement. The timeline began with an image captured by a student's phone that day on the university airstrip. Dr. Sarah Walker standing beside her sleek private jet, confronting a visibly flustered Dean Thompson about his dismissal of her daughter's achievements. "That should have been the most humiliating moment of my professional life," Thompson commented to a colleague who had joined him. "Instead, it became the catalyst for the most meaningful work I've ever done." "That's the power of how you responded," his colleague observed. "You could have become defensive or resigned. Instead, you chose to learn and grow." "I had help," Thompson acknowledged. "Sarah and Emma Walker could have simply exposed our biases and walked away. Instead, they remained engaged, challenging us while also providing pathways for meaningful change." Later that evening, at the conference's gala dinner, President Thompson received the inaugural Transformational Leadership Award for his role in sparking nationwide educational reform. As he accepted the honor, he reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past decade. This award recognizes not just one person or one institution, he told the assembled educators, but a movement that has fundamentally challenged how we define excellence, merit, and potential in education. What began with a confrontation over a rejected student has evolved into a reimagining of what education at its best can and should be. He held up the award, a crystal sculpture depicting diverse paths converging toward a common summit. I accept this honor with the humility of someone who began this journey as part of the problem, not the solution. My greatest contribution was simply having the courage to question assumptions I had long taken for granted, to recognize excellence in forms I'd been trained not to see. The applause that followed reflected not just appreciation for Thompson's remarks, but recognition of the broader transformation they represented, how institutions could evolve when leaders remained open to growth and learning. After the ceremony, President Thompson invited Dr. Sarah and Dr. Emma Walker to join him on the Convention Center's terrace, which offered a sweeping view of the capital city. As they looked out over the illuminated monuments, he handed them small boxes wrapped in Westridge's colors. "The board wanted you both to have these," he explained. "They're being awarded at commencement next month." The Walkers opened the boxes to find honorary doctorate certificates from Westridge University, Sarah in agricultural innovation and Emma in educational transformation. "I'm not sure what to say," Sarah remarked, genuinely moved by the gesture. "When I flew that jet onto your campus 10 years ago, I wasn't thinking about transforming education. I was just standing up for my daughter's dignity." "Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest human motivations," Thompson replied. "I've often wondered how differently things might have unfolded if I had simply taken the time to really see Emma's achievements during that first meeting. Then this movement might never have started," Emma observed. "Sometimes systems need disruption before they can evolve." As they returned to the gala, they passed an exhibit showcasing the impact of reformed admissions practices across diverse student populations, first-generation college students, rural innovators, urban problem solvers, and others whose brilliance had previously been overlooked by traditional metrics. One display particularly caught their attention: a comparative analysis showing how research teams with diverse backgrounds and perspectives consistently generated more innovative and effective solutions to complex problems than homogeneous teams with similar training. The research provided scientific validation for what their experience had already demonstrated: that excellence thrives in environments where different knowledge systems and perspectives can engage productively. "That's the real legacy," Emma noted, studying the display. "Not just more equitable access, but better outcomes for everyone. When institutions recognize excellence in all its forms, they don't just benefit the previously excluded, they enhance their ability to fulfill their core mission." As the conference concluded the following day with roundtable discussions on next steps for the movement, Thompson found himself reflecting on how completely his understanding of excellence had transformed. Since that confrontation on Westridge's airstrip, the administrator, who had once dismissed a brilliant young woman because she came from a farming background, now led a national movement recognizing that innovation thrives precisely at the intersection of different worlds, knowledge systems, and perspectives. What had begun as one mother's dramatic stand for her daughter's dignity had catalyzed changes extending far beyond one student or one institution. The private jet that had once seemed like an embarrassing disruption to Westridge's carefully cultivated image had become a powerful symbol of the need to recognize excellence wherever it exists, not just in its most familiar and privileged forms. As he prepared to transition from university leadership to his new national role, Richard Thompson understood that the movement he had helped build was still in its early stages. Deeply ingrained biases about merit, potential, and excellence remained embedded in educational institutions at every level, but the data supporting a more inclusive approach had become too compelling to ignore, and the network of committed educators working to expand the movement grew stronger each year. The educational revolution that began with a rejected farm girl and her mother's private jet had demonstrated a profound truth that was transforming institutions across the nation. That true excellence thrives not through exclusion, but through inclusion, not by narrowing the pathways to opportunity, but by recognizing the many different routes by which brilliance manifests in the world. And it had all begun with a moment of confrontation that could have ended with defensiveness and denial, but instead sparked a journey of growth, learning and transformation that continued to expand, touching more lives and institutions with each passing year. 25 years later, the sun cast long shadows across Westridge University's campus as people gathered for the dedication of the Walker Center for Rural Innovation. The striking modern building with its sustainable design, incorporating both cutting-edge technology and traditional agricultural architecture elements, stood as the newest addition to a campus that had been transformed not just physically, but philosophically over the past quarter century. An elderly woman in her late 70s moved slowly toward the podium, her steps measured, but her eyes still bright with the intelligence and vision that had defined her career. Dr. Patricia Chen, President Emerita of Westridge and former chair of the National Commission on Educational Access, smiled as she surveyed the crowd, a diverse gathering that would have been unimaginable during her early years as university president. 25 years ago on this very ground, she began, her voice still carrying surprising strength, a private jet landed on our airstrip and disrupted our carefully cultivated campus atmosphere, challenging assumptions that had gone unquestioned for generations. What could have been merely an embarrassing incident instead became the catalyst for the most profound transformation in American higher education in a century. The audience included current Westridge students and faculty, educational leaders from across the country, and dozens of graduates of what had become known as the Walker Scholars Program, brilliant innovators from rural backgrounds whose work was transforming agriculture, technology, environmental science, and public policy worldwide. At the center of the front row sat Dr. Emma Walker, now 43, and internationally renowned for her work in sustainable agricultural systems. As the founder of the Global Rural Innovation Network and recipient of both the World Food Prize and the National Medal of Science, she had become one of Westridge's most celebrated associates, despite never having been its student. Beside her sat several generations of her family, including her mother, Dr. Sarah Walker, now in her 70s, who had flown the private jet in that fateful confrontation 25 years earlier. The building we dedicate today, Dr. Chen continued, represents not just a physical space, but a philosophy that has reshaped how we recognize and nurture human potential. The Walker Center will serve as both an educational facility and a global hub connecting rural innovators worldwide with the resources, mentorship, and institutional support their brilliance deserves. The journey from confrontation to collaboration had continued to evolve over the decades. What began as Westridge's internal reforms had expanded into a national movement and eventually into a global network dedicated to recognizing excellence in all its diverse manifestations. The once elite university that had rejected a brilliant farm girl had transformed into a world leader in identifying and developing talent from previously overlooked backgrounds and communities. When I reflect on the changes of the past 25 years, Chen acknowledged, I'm reminded of how often transformation begins with discomfort, with moments that challenge our certainties and force us to reconsider deeply held assumptions. The private jet that landed on our airstrip represented not just a mother's defense of her daughter's dignity, but a fundamental challenge to how we defined excellence, merit, and potential. The audience included many who had been skeptical of or even opposed to Westridge's initial reforms. Several trustees who had initially feared lowering standards now served as the institution's most vocal advocates for inclusive excellence, having seen how expanding their definition of merit had dramatically strengthened rather than weakened the university's academic standing and impact. After Dr. Chen's opening remarks, the current Westridge president, Dr. Marcus Williams, himself a first-generation college graduate from a rural community in Georgia, approached the podium. At 52, he represented the generational shift that had occurred as institutions increasingly recognized leadership potential in those with non-traditional backgrounds. The Walker Center we dedicate today, President Williams explained, will house our expanding rural innovation programs, connecting brilliant young people from agricultural communities worldwide with the resources, mentorship, and technological tools to address humanity's most pressing challenges. The center includes research facilities, collaborative spaces, and global communication technologies that will allow rural innovators to engage with each other and with research institutions across traditional boundaries. The architectural design of the center reflected its mission, a harmonious blend of traditional barn timber framing with cutting-edge sustainable materials and technology. Solar panels that doubled as crop protection covers in the adjacent teaching fields powered the facility, while water reclamation systems demonstrated the integrated approach to resource management that had become a hallmark of the Walker approach to innovation. When it came time for Dr. Emma Walker to speak, she was helped to the podium by her eldest daughter, who was now completing her doctorate at Westridge in agricultural data systems. At 43, Walker carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone whose work had transformed not just institutions, but lives around the world. When I was rejected by Westridge 25 years ago, she began with the directness that had become her trademark, it represented more than personal disappointment. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about where innovation comes from and how excellence manifests in diverse forms. She gestured toward the crowd of Walker scholars, hundreds of graduates from rural backgrounds whose brilliance had been recognized and nurtured through the program established in her name. These remarkable individuals represent what happens when institutions look beyond traditional markers of achievement to recognize potential wherever it exists. Their work in sustainable agriculture, climate adaptation, rural healthcare, and technological innovation is addressing challenges that can only be solved by bringing different knowledge systems together. The Walker Scholars Program, established 15 years earlier through a major endowment from Walker AgriTech Solutions, had become one of the most prestigious and competitive fellowships in higher education. Unlike traditional scholarship programs that relied primarily on standardized metrics, the selection process incorporated innovative assessment approaches designed to identify exceptional problem-solving abilities, creativity, and practical innovation, skills that might not be captured by conventional academic measures. The building that bears my family's name, Emma continued, represents a philosophy rather than a tribute. The understanding that brilliance exists in every community and context, that innovation often emerges from the intersection of different knowledge systems, and that institutions truly committed to excellence must continually expand their vision of where and how that excellence might appear. After the formal speeches, as attendees explored the new facility, Dr. Chen found a quiet moment with Dr. Sarah Walker, who had watched the proceedings with evident emotion. Now in her 70s, she moved with the assistance of a cane, but retained the sharp intelligence and quiet dignity that had characterized her confrontation with Westridge's administration a quarter-century earlier. "Did you ever imagine this?" Chen asked, gesturing toward the center and the diverse gathering of students, faculty, and innovators flowing through its spaces. Sarah smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "Not specifically, no. When I flew that jet onto your campus, I wasn't thinking about institutional transformation or educational philosophy. I was simply defending my daughter's dignity and challenging the arbitrary barriers placed in her path." Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest human impulses, Chen observed. Your willingness to disrupt the status quo created space for questions that needed to be asked. And your administration's willingness to engage with those questions rather than becoming defensive created the possibility for genuine transformation, Sarah replied. Many in your position would have simply dismissed us as troublemakers and carried on as before. They were joined by Emma, who had been speaking with a group of current Walker scholars, young innovators from farming communities across the globe whose potential had been recognized through the expanded metrics Westridge had pioneered. The first cohort of global Walker scholars is already making remarkable progress, she reported. The young woman from Kenya has developed an integrated pest management system that's increased yields by 40% while reducing chemical inputs. The brother and sister team from Vietnam have created a flood-resistant rice variety that maintains production even with sea level rise. What struck Chen most as she listened to these accounts was how completely Westridge's definition of excellence had transformed. The institution that had once measured its success through exclusivity, proudly rejecting over 95% of applicants, now celebrated its ability to identify and nurture brilliant young people who would never have been considered under its former metrics. As part of the day's events, a special exhibition had been mounted in the center's main hall, documenting the 25-year journey from confrontation to collaboration. The centerpiece was the original photograph captured by a student's phone. Dr. Sarah Walker standing beside her impressive private jet, confronting then Dean Thompson about his dismissal of her daughter's achievements. Beside this image was a timeline showing the evolution of Westridge's policies and practices, alongside data demonstrating how these changes had strengthened rather than weakened the institution. Research output had increased by over 200%. Patents and innovations emerging from Westridge had quadrupled. Most significantly, graduates were demonstrating exceptional impact in addressing complex global challenges, from climate change to food security to sustainable development. The data is undeniable, noted the current Dean of Admissions, who had joined the group as they viewed the exhibition. When we expanded our definition of excellence and developed more sophisticated tools to identify potential in its many forms, we didn't lower our standards. We raised them by recognizing brilliance we had previously missed. As the day's festivities continued into evening, a special ceremony honored the original Walker scholar, the first rural student admitted under Westridge's reformed admissions criteria 25 years earlier. Now a distinguished professor of environmental engineering, she had developed water conservation technologies that were being implemented in drought-prone regions worldwide. When Dean Thompson called to tell me I'd been accepted to Westridge, I thought it was a prank, the professor recalled to appreciative laughter. My high school counselor had told me not to bother applying to elite universities because they weren't for people like us. Now, my own daughter is a sophomore here, studying agricultural economics alongside students from every conceivable background. Richard Thompson himself, now in his mid-80s, had made the journey to campus specifically for this dedication. His tenure as Westridge's president had ended 15 years earlier, but his legacy lived on in the institutional transformation he had championed. After initially leading the admissions reforms, Thompson had succeeded President Chen, serving 10 years as Westridge's president before moving on to lead national efforts to transform educational access. As the evening progressed, Thompson found himself seated with Sarah and Emma Walker, the three figures whose confrontation 25 years earlier had sparked a revolution in higher education, now united in celebrating its culmination. "I've been thinking about that moment in my office when I dismissed your research," Thompson admitted to Emma. "Do you remember what I said?" "We cultivate global leaders at Westridge, not local farmers," Emma quoted with a smile that held no bitterness. Words that have become rather famous in educational circles. "The great irony," Thompson reflected, "is that your work cultivating drought-resistant crops has saved more lives and done more good than all the theoretical papers I thought represented true intellectual excellence. You were cultivating both food security and intellectual excellence, while I couldn't see beyond my narrow definitions of what counted as valuable knowledge." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Educational institutions have tremendous power to either validate or dismiss different forms of knowledge and achievement. The real transformation of the past 25 years hasn't been about who gets admitted to elite universities. It's been about expanding our understanding of what constitutes excellence and where innovation can emerge. As they looked out over the campus, where students from farming communities now studied alongside those from urban centers and suburbs, from wealthy families and modest backgrounds, from traditional academic pathways and unconventional routes to achievement, they witnessed the living legacy of their unlikely collaboration. What had begun as a moment of confrontation, a mother defending her daughter's dignity against institutional dismissal, had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond one student or one university. The private jet that had once seemed like an embarrassing disruption to Westridge's carefully cultivated image had become a powerful symbol in educational circles. A reminder that excellence manifests in many forms and that institutions must continually expand their vision to recognize brilliance wherever it appears. The Walker Center for Rural Innovation stood as a physical embodiment of this philosophy. Not just a building, but a bridge between worlds that had once seemed separate: theoretical and practical knowledge, academic tradition, and real-world innovation. Privileged institutions and rural communities. Its mission extended beyond education in the traditional sense to the broader purpose of connecting human potential with the resources needed to address humanity's most pressing challenges. And it had all begun with those dismissive words, "not local farmers," spoken in an admissions office 25 years earlier. Words that had sparked a confrontation that could have ended with bitterness and recrimination, but instead had yielded growth, collaboration, and transformation that continued to expand with each passing year, changing not just who had access to educational opportunity, but how excellence itself was understood and nurtured in a complex and interconnected world. As night fell over the campus, the Walker Center was illuminated from within, its innovative design creating a pattern of light that resembled stars scattered across a rural night sky. The gathered community moved outside for a final ceremony, the illumination of a simple sculpture installed at the exact spot where Dr. Walker's jet had parked 25 years earlier. The sculpture, titled Convergence, represented two different paths coming together: traditional agricultural knowledge, and advanced scientific research joining to create something stronger than either alone. As lights activated at its base, President Williams invited Dr. Chen, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Sarah Walker, and Dr. Emma Walker to stand together beside the artwork. 25 years ago, these four individuals stood on this spot as adversaries, he noted. Today they stand as collaborators whose willingness to move beyond confrontation toward mutual understanding has transformed not just Westridge, but educational institutions worldwide. The four figures, the former university leaders who had defended, then reformed a flawed system, the mother who had challenged it, and the daughter whose brilliance had been initially dismissed, stood together as living embodiment of how conflict, when approached with openness rather than defensiveness, could yield transformation rather than mere opposition. The celebration continued well into the night, with conversations between rural innovators and academic researchers, between students from farming backgrounds and those from urban centers, between faculty trained in traditional disciplines and those pioneering new interdisciplinary approaches. The boundaries that had once seemed so firm and necessary had become permeable, allowing knowledge and innovation to flow freely between worlds that had previously remained separate. In one corner of the center's main atrium, a display had been set up showing the global impact of innovations that had emerged from the first decade of the Walker Scholars Program. Drought-resistant crop varieties now cultivated on 4 continents, water conservation technologies implemented in 17 countries, rural healthcare delivery systems adapted for communities from Appalachia to the Amazon. Each innovation represented a life-changing or life-saving application of knowledge that bridged theoretical understanding with practical implementation. Beside this display, a simple quote had been mounted on the wall, words Emma had spoken during her TED Talk 15 years earlier, which had since become something of a mantra for the movement she had helped inspire. Excellence isn't confined to elite spaces. Innovation doesn't respect artificial boundaries. The most powerful solutions emerge when we recognize brilliance wherever it grows. As the evening wound down, Emma found herself standing with her daughter beside the large windows overlooking the teaching fields adjacent to the center, fields where experiments in sustainable agriculture were already underway, tended by students from farming backgrounds now studying at one of the world's most prestigious universities. "Do you think grandmother knew what she was starting when she flew that jet here?" her daughter asked. Emma smiled. "I don't think any of us could have imagined where that confrontation would lead. Mom was just standing up for me, for the principle that my work deserved serious consideration regardless of where it was conducted or where I came from. It's strange to think that if they had accepted you, none of this might have happened," her daughter observed. "You'd have just been another Westridge student." "That's often how change works," Emma replied. "It doesn't come from comfortable inclusion in existing systems. It comes from the friction of exclusion, from the questions that arise when qualified. People are kept out of spaces where they could contribute." Across the room, Thompson was engaged in conversation with a group of current Walker scholars, listening intently as they described innovations they were developing, technologies and approaches that bridge their practical experience growing up in agricultural communities with the advanced scientific training they were receiving at Westridge. The traditional approach would have been to teach them to abandon their rural perspectives and adopt purely academic frameworks, observed President Williams, who had joined Emma by the windows. "Instead, we've created space for them to integrate different knowledge systems, to value both the generations of practical wisdom they bring from their communities and the theoretical frameworks they're learning here. That integration is where the most powerful innovations emerge," Emma noted, "not from choosing between different ways of knowing, but from bringing them into productive conversation." As the celebration finally concluded, Emma found herself standing alone with Thompson in the center's entrance hall. The former adversaries whose confrontation had sparked such profound change looked out over the campus that had been transformed by their unlikely collaboration. "I've sometimes wondered," Thompson said quietly, "what would have happened if I had recognized the value of your research during that first meeting, if I had been able to see beyond my own limited understanding of excellence. Then I'd have had a perfectly good education at Westridge," Emma replied. "But the institutional transformation that has benefited thousands of students might never have happened. Sometimes systems need to be disrupted before they can evolve." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I've come to believe that our greatest service to education wasn't what either of us did individually, your brilliant research or my administrative reforms. It was the collision between your mother's advocacy and my initial resistance that created the energy for real change. And your willingness to learn from that collision rather than merely becoming defensive," Emma added. "That's rarer than you might think." As they prepared to depart, they paused before the illuminated sculpture that marked the spot where Sarah Walker's jet had parked 25 years earlier. The convergence of paths it represented, traditional knowledge meeting academic theory, practical experience engaging with scientific research, had become Westridge's guiding philosophy and the foundation of a movement that was transforming education worldwide. "Did you know," Thompson said, "that applications to the Walker Scholars Program this year came from 67 countries? Brilliant young innovators from rural communities around the world who once would never have considered institutions like Westridge now see it as a place where their unique perspectives are valued." "That's the real measure of transformation," Emma observed. "Not just who gets admitted, but who feels invited to apply, who sees themselves as potential contributors to knowledge rather than passive recipients of it." The final guests departed, leaving the Walker Center illuminated against the night sky, a beacon of a new approach to excellence that recognized brilliance in all its diverse manifestations. The building itself embodied the philosophy it housed, with its integration of traditional timber framing and cutting-edge sustainable design. Its spaces created specifically to facilitate collaboration across disciplines and backgrounds. As Emma walked toward her car, she passed a bulletin board where students had posted notices about upcoming projects and collaborations. Among them was a flyer for a new initiative called Rural Innovations for Global Challenges, a program that would connect Walker scholars with communities worldwide to develop solutions for food security, climate adaptation, and sustainable development. The flyer's headline read, "We cultivate agricultural innovations and global leaders." Emma smiled at the deliberate reference to Thompson's dismissive words from 25 years earlier, now transformed into an affirmation of the very integration he had once rejected. It was perhaps the most fitting tribute to their journey, not erasing the past, but transforming it, using the energy of confrontation to fuel ongoing evolution. As she drove away from campus, Emma reflected on the quarter-century journey that had brought them to this moment. The painful rejection that had initially seemed like a door closing had instead opened countless doors for others. The confrontation that might have ended in bitterness had instead yielded collaboration that continued to generate new possibilities. And it had all begun with a mother's determination to stand up for her daughter's dignity, a private jet landing where it wasn't expected, and an institution's eventual willingness to recognize that excellence manifests in many forms, sometimes arriving in ways and from places that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about who belongs in the spaces where knowledge is created and innovation nurtured. The Walker Center for Rural Innovation stood illuminated against the night sky, no longer an elite institution's concession to diversity, but a testament to a transformed understanding of excellence itself, one that recognized brilliance wherever. It grew and created pathways for it to flourish, regardless of where those paths began or how unfamiliar they might initially appear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.